Tess here with FCS Quilting, and I'm going to teach you how to do FPP. To start, you'll have your printed sheet and your first piece of fabric. They're all numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Wrong sides go together, wrong side paper, wrong side fabric. For this first one, you are going to have to glue it down. I'm going to try to center this flower. So I'm going to start by kind of holding this up to the light. One day I will have a light board, and that will be nice. Then I like my glue stick, put a little dab of glue there, pinch my flowers, and place those right where the center is. You need to hold your first one down with glue because it's not getting sewn until you connect another piece to it. So we're gonna flip to this side. We have our wrong side paper, wrong side fabric. Flip it over. I really like the add a quarter plus ruler. It tapers here so we can find our line that is in between A1, A2. And you're gonna crease the whole length of the paper right along there. This step is optional. Some people do it, some people don't. I like to do it because it really helps me wrap my brain around where the next piece of fabric is gonna get placed. So I take the raised side, it nicely catches the paper, and I trim this piece of fabric down to that 1/4 inch right away. And grab my next piece of fabric. So this is going to be my A2 piece. So once this is opened up and flat, it's going to lay here. However, the tricky part about FPP is learning that when this is folded, the reason we fold it is so we know where we need to place our next piece. You're going to place that underneath fabric, like any other time you're sewing, our right sides together. So we're going to place the fabric so it is underneath our piece that's folded down. So when the piece is folded, your piece goes underneath that. Because then when we pick it up and we're gonna sew, we'll open it up to sew it, and then it's folded out, and then it folds out. So it's kind of tricky how it's like, oh, it's underneath. I know that these lines are my edges. So when this is folded, I like to place this, I just kind of make sure I place my fingers where my edges are. So I know that this piece is getting under where it needs to go and isn't shifted. Now you see I'm lining up my raw edges. You are not going to be able to do that for every piece that you do, because if, say, this piece went unfolded, shot off like up in this direction, when I fold this down, if I only put my piece with the raw edges lined up, it would unfold perfectly straight out, but I would need it to go off this way. So say if it went off this way, but then folded down, it goes this way, you'd have to make sure that this piece of fabric lines up correctly underneath. But anyway, got your fabric, right sides together. We're going to bring this to the machine. I like to have my machine on the needle in the middle, and you have to drop your stitch length down to between 1.6 to 1.8. The shorter stitch length allows your paper to just rip nicer and easier later on. You're only gonna sew on the line. I do back stitch a little bit, just a little. Let's find the footbell here. And you sew right on the line. You don't wanna sew past the line, and I'll show you why in the next step. Because you still need to fold other lines, and if your stitching goes past, you're not gonna be able to fold. And if you do go past a little bit, you'll probably have to seam rip a little bit. One of the things that I really like about FPP is that I'm constantly on top of keeping my threads trimmed. And my son's little recycling bin there. All right, so if your fabric was not lined up edge to edge here, and I can show you what I mean by that on the next one, you would then come back here with your 1/4 inch and trim again. If you don't have this kind of ruler, you can literally use any like quilting ruler. You unfold that and then open this up. And I kind of just like to pull it back to make sure my seam's nice and flat. Start by finger pressing, and then use a seam roller and just kind of push it down a little bit more. With FPP, you can't use an iron or you're gonna warp your paper. if you want, and I like to, I don't like a lot, but then just put like a little dot of glue to hold that in place so it doesn't shift around too much on you. So then we flip back to this side. All right, we did A2, now we move on to 3. So 1, 2, 3. This time I will show you, so the reason we didn't sew past this line is so that way we can fold this over here. Your line where you fold doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. It's more just to help you place your fabric. So if that's not a perfect fold, it's a little off, that's okay. What matters is the stitching. So as long as there's stitching on the line, you'll be good to go. So again, I like to trim. This step is not necessary, kind of adds a step, but it's what I like to do. So now my piece needs to go under here. A reason that you might place it another way is FPP can have a lot of scrap, a lot of fabric waste. So if I were to put it here and then trim this, like I can use this whole other half, where the way I kind of did it before, when I go to trim this one later on, I'm gonna only get like a smaller piece. So I'm gonna do it where, so fabric right sides together. I always put the piece I'm working with like down and lay this on top. So I have that. This one does have like seam allowance there. So I'm gonna fold it down, keep my fingers where that is, and I just need to make sure. It can be really tricky. A lot of people have like the light boards. Like I said, someday, just gonna make sure that's lined up under there. Now I'm not gonna do anything with this part yet. We're just gonna bring this to the machine. I like to bring it to the machine, kind of like keep pressure on it so the fabrics aren't shifting around, and then open this up, bring it here, and stitch right on that line again. Back stitch. I have my machine set to go nice and slow. Otherwise my pedal to the metal would not go over well. Trimming those threads. All right, here, if I had lined up my edges, I would be able to just flip this open and press it, but I have this whole chunk that I need to trim down to get my seam allowance. So we're gonna fold our paper back down, have that there. This is a part where if you're new, sometimes we can mess it up because we might fold this back out, lay it down, and then trim it, and then you're cutting off the piece you just sewed on. So you definitely want to make sure that your piece is still laying flat. Only fold the paper. Come in with your ruler. Trim off that excess. Set your scraps aside. I love scrappy projects. Now you can open up your paper. Open up this. Also, one of the beauties of FPP is the time save when it comes to your fabric cutting. I literally, this was scrap fabric that I just picked out to make sure it was high contrast, but I only cut big pieces that I knew would fit over things. So like, oh, that fits, covers that, and so on. I didn't have to sit there and super specific measure out every piece to be a certain size. Also, because your seam allowance is just cut, you don't have to make sure to sew the correct seam allowance. That's another thing I love about FPP, because you're gonna have the most beautiful, perfect points, which I can't wait till we get to that part, without having to make sure your seam allowance is that specific exact 1/4 of an inch. So we did 3, let's move on to 4. Again, creasing. I cut the extra just because I have figured out that if your piece does perfectly, like 180 degree is flush with this line, you can line up your edges, and that's where I save time in a step, because by lining up my raw edges, I don't have to trim afterwards, and then it makes it so I don't have to risk trimming off the piece I just sewed on. And I feel like it leaves me also with larger scrap pieces left over because I know it's a big enough area to cover, and so on. if you notice with my piece, the outer, like, not solid line is my seam allowance for when I connect this one to another one when we're all done with this one. I don't like to cut my pattern piece down that far right away. It just makes it a little easier to work with those outer pieces when there's more room. And then when you do trim it down, you're trimming the fabric at the same time instead of like trying to trim the fabric around the paper. And it just works out really nice to trim it all together to really get that perfect size. So, seam rolled. Last one of this color. I only learned FPP a few months ago, maybe not even a few months ago, and I'm already addicted. It's amazing. Once you get the hang of it, it's just so much faster, so much easier. I love it. Okay. So now I have my creases where my lines are, so I know that my little triangle underneath there, those edges are right there. You do need to make sure that it's like your piece is wide enough to have that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on each side. Another thing that's really a downfall of FPP is you don't get to choose which way your seams are pressed. So if you normally press to the lighter fabric or the darker fabric, you are going to be a little sad if your fabric shows through. So one thing I do is, say this was my lighter fabric, I was using a white. When lining up these edges, if you're able to do it this way, I always kind of tuck the darker fabric like down a little bit. I know my fabrics are opposite of what I'm talking about right now, but if it was sticking out like this, when I would fold it up, it would show through. So I just tuck it down a little bit. Yes, it's less than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but it works out better so your colors aren't showing through on your lighter fabrics. I do backstitch with FPP because you're never sewing over these lines again until you're quilting whatever it is you're making. So I backstitch for the sake of strength, because if you were doing normal, like traditional quilt piecing, you're gonna usually be like sewing over your lines, and that's just not the case with FPP. So again, I like pull it back. I realize I haven't been doing my gluing. If a piece is small enough, I don't usually glue, but I can now that I'll go around and put little dabs. And I don't want to like stretch it out as I lay it down. I kind of just like put my dab of glue and then, because I don't want to warp my project. I think that was the one that I had glue. And over there. All right, on to the next outer part. Because of the pattern I chose to show for this, it doesn't really matter like what order you did those in, or these, because there's not much overlap. But so now we're gonna fold this one. So this is where I make the most mistakes. I like to sew into my seam allowance. The only problem with that right now is I can't sew into my seam allowance on this first one, because I'm gonna have to crease here and I'm gonna have to crease here. So anywhere there's a line that's gonna be intersecting in the future, don't sew over it. But I will be able to sew this one from edge to edge. Once this one is sewn, this one, or like, I guess I would go 6, 7, I would then be able to start sewing, but we'll get there. So I'm gonna have that creased. I come in here. This is where this fabric is gonna get trimmed now. I also like this ruler because it's like a little finger guard, at least when it comes to trimming using the other side of it. Right now it is not, but into this fabric. Good old dainty daisy. Like that. Find my edges just to make sure I get my correct seam allowance there. Alright, looks good. Bring it around here. One thing about the stitch length, it is going to be preference. I have found that I like the 1.8 because a seam ripper can still fit in it. You know, good thing to keep in mind. I definitely make mistakes still. Probably always will, but that is the learning process. Alright, so I did not sew into my seam allowance yet on the other side, and I'm not going to on this side. Just a couple stitches back. But this next one, I will be able to sew into the seam allowance a little bit. So if we open this up, that is where we get our beautiful points, because as long as you're always sewing on those lines, you're gonna have the same intersections and same points that the paper has. So the paper has a beautiful point, so our sewing does. Because this is like a larger edge piece and it's eventually gonna get trimmed down to my seam allowance, I do for sure on my outer pieces like to tack it down with a little glue. I really like this glue. I have not personally used, like, I know some people use Elmer's. I haven't done that on any of my projects yet because this was the first thing I tried and I really like it. Actually comes off, it holds great and comes off easily when it's time to rip the paper out. Right, number 7. I don't remember if I mentioned, but for every piece that you need to make, the paper template is a one and done. So you need to print as many copies as you need for what you're doing. Lay my fabric right side up. Find where my edges are. Lay it down. Somehow I do manage to like twist my fabric a lot. It's probably when I do this part, but. Okay, I can't back stitch into the seam allowance yet, but because I've already sewn this line and I don't need to make this crease again, I am now going to stitch off past and do this seam allowance here. So I'm gonna stop at the edge here, sew all the way. You don't want to sew past this seam allowance edge though. You might be like, oh, I'll just like keep going. Because you are going to cut this and there's no point in stitching past if you're just gonna be cutting it. So I do stitch up to that line, back stitch, right there. If you've noticed with FPP, you tend to build from the inside out. That's what allows you to do it. I'm always blown away how well the seam roller like flattens that out. Right, a little dab of glue and another beautiful point. So we're just gonna finish up our last 2. When it comes to rotary cutter, you're gonna want to make sure to pick one that you don't mind if it goes through paper. This has become my FPP rotary cutter because when you do trim this down later on, you're gonna be cutting the actual paper itself. So I know that goes against everything you've ever learned about quilting and fabric cutting. Save the good ones. Again, not back stitching into the seam allowance on this one, but going to it at the other end. One thing I want to mention that I have not personally tried to do yet because I haven't had a project that calls for it. I personally like to work with solids, which solids and FPP, oh, great pair because you don't have to worry about right side, wrong side, and you can just flop it down and it's okay if it's whatever side. So, but I purposefully chose to make this with patterned fabric to show fabric right sides go together, paper and fabric wrong sides go together. You know, if you're brave enough to do that, go ahead and give it a try. I'm not there yet. So, moving on. I trimmed that. We'll put that down. I have my creases. Ooh, that one was a little narrow, but it still works. Alright, this is my last piece, and I don't have to do any more creasing, so I am going to, and I could have started farther back, going to back stitch all the way into the seam allowance now. When you can, sew into the seam allowance. It just prevents your fabric from hanging out back there and not laying where it should. Just keeps everything in its place. And we're done. All right. So we have all of our pieces sewn on. Once you get the hang of it, it is not as scary and as intimidating as you might think. I think I don't, that was glued. See how well that held? All right. Glue, and then this one I didn't. Again, gluing is optional. Like, some people don't glue at all except for that first piece. Some people use copious amounts of glue for all of it. All right, it's done. Let's trim it up to size. This is where I also really like this. I have cut myself with my rotary cutter before, so I like that this is a nice little like barrier. I'm going to line up with my seam allowance. Rest in peace rotary cutter blade. I have to twist a little bit here or I'm not going to be able to cut this. Those scraps I'll save. All right, so I just cut right on that dotted line and it gave me that nice crisp edge there. All the way around, trim it up. When you are done, I highly recommend that you do not remove the paper until you are completely done sewing all of your pieces together. So I've got some over there. I'm going to show you how to sew pieces together, and I still have all of the paper in all of those. The paper, it's great because it just, you don't have to worry about like your fabric warping, again, the seam allowance. It's just so crisp and clean and neat. That goes in there, my little garbage can. My little buddy is out on a walk with Dad, so he can't empty my garbage for me right now, but I'm sure he will when he gets back. Okay, so first piece all done. Beautiful. Ta-da. I didn't center that as well as I could have, but all right. So I have all of these. There is one exception to when you tear paper, and it's when connecting pieces that are already sewn together. So I'm going to sew these two together to show you then how to just do it all and to make sure your points line up correctly. There is a technical name for a method that you can do, and I forgot to grab a pin here, so let me just grab a pin really quick, where you can line up your points with a pin. So I want to make sure that this, let's see, I'm doing these edges here. These are the same piece, so they're both A, but if you had like an A and a B, usually the pattern would be like A, B, and it just, you sew it all together backwards. This would be like A and B. You'd want to do A, B, but it's A, B because then when you flip it this way, it's A, B. Anyway, getting off track here. So start with one. I want to make sure that these 2 points line up as nicely as my other ones. So I learned this at a sewing, actually an FPP class. You poke your pin right through there. I know there's a technical name for it, and it should come out pretty much like right on your point. My stitching is making it a smidge hard to see. And then you come in here, and we want it to go through this point right here. So you poke the pin right where you want it, and it should pretty much come out right at that. Then I slide them together, sandwich them up. If your pin is not straight, your points aren't going to line up. So pretty much just move your pieces till your pin is like perfectly perpendicular going through your fabrics. Your edges should then nicely line up too. At this point, you can put a clip and take your pin out because you don't sew with pins like that. If you were trying to like do a classic pin style, you would shift it. I'm gonna be brave here and not use a clip. Usually I just line up the edges of my paper unless I really care. And now you're gonna sew right along this, and I do sew the seam allowance as well here. So I'm gonna get that centered. I'm not always the best at getting this perfectly lined up right now, but like you, I am a beginner. And just like all the other times, we're just sewing right along that line, and I can tell that this is shifting a little bit. Should have used a clip. All right, and now we have come to the point where we are going to do a little bit of paper tearing and removing. All right, so this opens up and our points are beautiful. They nicely line up. So I'm going to show you how to connect these two, and this is where you're going to do some paper tearing. You're going to remove the paper that is your seam allowance here, because you don't want to have this folded and sew over that, and then you have your little tiny bits of paper like stuck under there. So I like to crease it back and forth a little bit and just tear that out. The nice smaller stitch size makes this surprisingly easier than I was anticipating before I learned. And then the nice part too about that is when you do go to take the rest of your paper out, it like nicely kind of comes out from the next spot. So I did that side. We'll have that be the bottom one because I did that. And then we'll do this one. Just tearing out our seam allowance. And then if you wanted, you could do the pin trick again. Can't remember what the technical name for that trick is, but all right, make sure they're like that, right sides together. I, however, just look at my seams. You can decide which ones lay which way. Line that up. I'm gonna have it like that, like this. All right, again, not clipping. Wish me luck. Probably should clip. Gonna make sure that this is nice and square. I want that seam to go that way. Yeah, definitely clip if you can. I was trying to save time for video's sake. All right, this is all I am sewing for this because I just made these specifically for this video. If you had more that you were attaching to this piece, again, don't tear paper yet, but if you were ready to be done, ta-da! Crisp points, look at those. Oh, just lays so flat. Points are so nice. So then you can go in and start tearing paper once you are done. And it rips out pretty nice. Of course, now that I'm telling you it does, it's not going to. Tweezers are helpful. I am always a little afraid for my seams, but yeah. And there you go. That's FPP. I hope you learned something. Have fun with it.